Welcome to Spirit in the Frame, the podcast about art that unnerves, enchants, and sometimes demands offerings. I'm your host, Dave Zilla, illustrator, witch, tarot designer, and part-time ghost therapist. If you like your art steeped in symbolism, cryptically coded, and maybe a little haunted, you're in the right place. Today, it's just you, me, and a topic pulled from the shadows. In 1970, a robotics professor named Masahiro Mori scribbled something kind of weird in an engineering journal. He wasn't talking about ghosts, but he might as well have been. He said that as a robot becomes more human-like, we grow more comfortable with it until we don't. Once it gets too human, something flips and then comfort turns to horror. We fall into what he called Bukimi no Tani Ginshyo, the Uncanny Valley. What creeped Mori out even more was movement. Stillness is bad, but motion is worse. A mannequin that just stands there, that's fine. But if it blinks or if it breathes just a little off rhythm, then you feel that in your gut. It's not a threat exactly. It's a glitch in your internal warning system. You don't know why you want to run. You just do. But here's the twist. This wasn't really a new idea. 200 years earlier, the playwright Chigamatsu Monzaemon was writing puppet plays that were so emotionally raw, people would weep in the aisles. He believed that puppets could show a deeper emotion than live actors. There was some debate about this. Some critics said if the puppet moves too well, too smoothly, it stops being art, starts being a little unnatural. They actually feared that the realism could become possession. So when Mori drew that curve, he wasn't just warning engineers, he was rephrasing an old fear of ours. What happens when a creation forgets it's not alive? Or worse, what happens when you forget? Your brain is a pattern-hungry animal. It is designed and evolved to detect faces in fog, in fire, in the bark of trees. Like I said in the last episode, survival often meant spotting the difference between a branch or a predator wearing camouflage. Sometimes the brain sees a little too much. It locks onto something that looks almost human and it throws kind of a neurological tantrum. The amygdala, your brain's threat detector, lights up like a warning flare. Studies show that when we see an almost human face that falls short, the amygdala spikes. You're not just creeped out, you're afraid, and you don't know why. But here's the real kicker. Face doesn't even need to look that wrong. It can be just a little bit like you to get under your skin. Recent studies showed that faces with subtle self-resemblance, just a few shared features, trigger higher amygdala responses when distorted. So when a doll's face vaguely echoes your own, or a deep fake blinks with your eye rhythm, a portrait looks like it could be your cousin or your corpse, that's not paranoia. That's your nervous system screaming in its own code. This isn't just academic. When people see uncanny faces, they report nausea, disgust. Some even start sweating. The closer you get to that realism without reaching it, the deeper the revulsion. That is a hell of a tightrope. Let's take a little walk. You'll want to keep your hands inside the veil this time. First stop, 19th century, elegant salons in Paris and Vienna where clockwork children sip imaginary tea and mechanical swans dive out for fake fish. Those automaton things, they were marvels. They were beautiful, intricate, and very wrong. Their faces were never quite matched their motions. Their joints betrayed them, and sometimes they moved after being turned off. Fast forward to 2004, there was a movie called The Polar Express with Tom Hanks rendered in CGI, stared out from a face that should feel really warm, but it really doesn't. The eyes don't track right. The skin moves, but nothing lives behind it. The kids in the test audience cried, but not for the right reasons. Now let's talk about cribs. The reborn doll community crafts lifelike babies with such detail, veins, birthmarks, capillaries, you'd swear they were really there and sleeping. Some are carried in slings, some are tucked in car seats. They are loved, rocked, and fed, but you hold one too long and you'll feel it. Something human's missing. And the mind hates that absence. And then there's AI. Deep fake portraits now are rendering faces that never exist, but they seem very familiar. Some carry the ghost echo of a friend or a relative or an ex. And some audiences are training these GANs to create portraits that are almost sentient. They seem almost aware. One tilts your head and you swear the thing just looked at you. This isn't just modern horror. Occult history drips with doubles. The fetch in Celtic lore is a spectral twin that can appear to you before your death. Doppelgangers, it's a mirror self that brings you misfortune. The changelings in fairy lore were a perfect-looking copy with something inside it's a little missing. We've always feared what mimics us, and the reason we do is because sometimes that echo is louder than the voice. So this is all very interesting so far. Robots, faces, fear responses, motion capture glitches, and you may be asking, great Dave, but what the hell does that have to do with the occult? Everything. The Uncanny Valley is not just a psychological dip. It's a spiritual warning system, and the occult has always been concerned with boundaries, life and death, flesh versus spirit, real versus false. In the Uncanny Valley, that's the moment your body knows it's crossed a line, something that shouldn't exist, but does. We've had names for these things for centuries. A doll that watches, a statue that weeps. In magic, these aren't just metaphors, they're thresholds. If you really think about it, why do so many magical traditions warn you about looking too deeply into reflections? Why does folklore brim with doubles, spirits that mimic the human form in order to steal warmth, memory, or identity? Because imitation invites occupation. Every spellcaster worth their salt knows if you craft a likeness, you better know what might crawl into it. And that's why puppets are such an old magic. You shape a figure with someone's image and fill it with breath, herbs, spit, personal threads. You've got a sympathetic link. If it's done right, it's a conduit. If it's done wrong, it's a vessel. Same with masks, same with mirrors, same with those AI-generated portraits that feel like someone's staring back. The Uncanny Valley isn't just a feeling. It's a fingerprint, a signature left behind when something tries too hard to pass. Spirits don't show up with red eyes and CGI flame trails. They come looking like your grandma, your lover, your reflection, but a little off. And that offness is your only warning. Magic in this light isn't really about fantasy. It's about pattern recognition. It's about learning, when to trust your instincts, when to flinch, when to run. We know this feeling. We've named it, not in neuroscience journals, but in whispered warnings, in horror films, internet lore, creepypasta, police reports that no one can explain. These are the faces that hover in the Uncanny Valley, in that threshold. Here's some examples. Indrid Cold, remember that grinning man that spoke telepathically and his mouth was like ridiculously wide in the Mothman prophecies? He wasn't quite human. The people who saw him said his face looked manufactured. What about Slender Man? He came from a Photoshop contest, but he became an American myth now. He's tall, featureless, and he wears our clothes, but none of our mercy. Hat Man. Shows up in sleep paralysis episodes everywhere, and he's always watching, always waiting, even though he has no eyes, just awareness. Or what about Annabelle, the Raggedy Ann doll? Lives in a glass case in Connecticut. She's said to breathe, move, and be a puppet of something a lot worse than a doll. Of course, there's also those black-eyed children. They knock at your door asking to come inside, and they're almost human, except for their eyes, of course. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's doppelgangers, those things that look exactly like you and walk like you, move like you, dress like you, but they show up after you've already gotten somewhere. These figures, they live at the junction where technology meets folklore, where familiar gets kind of like skinned and rewired, and they don't just scare us because they look strange, they scare us because they almost don't. And in every case, the question isn't just what are they, it's who invited them in? So how do we survive this? How do artists dodge the Uncanny Valley? Trick turns out is stylization. Bigger eyes, softer shadows, exaggerated movement. Think about Pixar films. Every single character rides really far from that Uncanny Valley. They don't ever cross it. You trust them instantly because your brain isn't comparing them to a corpse. In religious art, saints are often haloed. The goal isn't realism, the goal is reverence. The closer you get to divine or diabolical likeness, the more dangerous that game becomes. And this is why a lot of magical traditions don't let you finish a statue. Sometimes a golem with no name is just clay. A mask with no eyes, it's kind of inert, right? But if you breathe some life into it, or you name it, or you give it a heartbeat, well, now you've crossed a line. In ritual magic, you often bind a name before you sculpt the form. You might exhale into the effigy or place a sigil under your tongue, because walking a false face without protection, that's not art, that's invitation. And when faces go wrong, we flinch. And when they go too wrong, we do something much older. We go reaching for masks, not to hide, but to protect. to hold that boundary between spirit and skin, to say this is me and that is not. Next week, we're going to talk about masks and why covering your face just might save your soul. If this episode whispered something strange in your ear, go ahead and click like. Maybe even subscribe. Cool kids subscribe, so do witches, ghosts, and the occasional cryptid with Wi-Fi.